Occasionally in your life, when you're a scholar, you get to bring all of the people that you ever study and read to sit on a single panel. And it's, some people collect baseball cards, other people collect academic articles. I'm the one who collects academic articles, and I essentially got to assemble one of my dream teams up here. So this panel covers international security, cyber, and the future of nations. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kenneth Geers, one of the original founders of NATO CCDCOE.
Hello. Okay, I think you can hear me. Just a quick raise of hands. Have you been to CyCon in Estonia? Anyone? Yes?
Did you drink heavily?
No, that's great. I'm glad to see that, and I certainly hope to see you there 2017. So a little bit of my background as well, having gone to Estonia in 2007 during the big cyber attacks and seeing how they evolve over time. I just got back from a couple of years in Ukraine, where I think the type of attacks we're seeing is quite different. There's the CIA, the confidentiality and integrity and availability, and there's really the whole range. And now we're seeing the weaponization of doxing across borders, and so it's complicated, right? It's a big space where you can do a lot of different things. Well, this panel here, really and truly, as Aaron said, it couldn't be better to talk about the issue of international relations, international conflict, international security in cyberspace. So I'll just go ahead and move right to the first question. I've got 9 questions, and then we'll open it to the floor and let you ask questions. But the first question I'd like to put to our Israeli colleague, Uzi Moscovici, and it goes really to what the role does cyber play in power, in national power today, in terms of defending sovereignty, applying force, projecting power, both within and across borders. So I'll cede the floor to Uzi.
All right, thanks a lot. Am I heard? Apparently, yes. I have upon my shoulders the ungrateful task of trying to keep the audience not falling asleep after lunch, which is known to be inherently an ungrateful task. So I'd say only that. Cyber will play a very significant, huge role in the power of nations. Next speaker, please. No, this is not. I've told you, I have my tricks, I have my ways. Anyhow, I will present myself in 2 or 3 sentences. I'm a fresh retiree. I just got out of the military after serving for 34 and a half years. And I remember each and every month of it. My last role, which I held for a little less than 5 years, is that if I go to military terminology, I was the J6 and the C4I. We have a unified or a double head type of a command architecture within the IDF. The C4I and the J6 are unified. And if I go to civil terminology, then I was the CIO and the CISO, the Chief Information Officer, and the Chief Information Security Officer of the IDF as well. This is an ingenious decision. It was taken before I held office, so I take no responsibility, or I take no applause for it. And the fact that this is, in my view, an ingenious type of a decision is the fact that there is an inherent tension between the functions of the CIO and the Chief Information Security Officer. This goes for civil life and for military life. The Chief Information Officer is the one that is very much in favor of connectivity, interoperability, innovation, bring your own device, bring your own application, whatever. And the Chief Information Security Officer is, by definition, the guy who is a little bit more conservative. He would pull the Chief Information Officer on the sleeve and say, okay, be a little bit more conservative on that because we lack response, or our response is partial. And the fact that I held 2 positions didn't make the dispute disappear. It just left the one decision maker to be responsible for the balance. As far as cyber as a component or an ingredient within the national power, I looked in some political science publications before. I made my comments, and of course there are classical definitions of the components or the ingredients of national power. Of course you have the military, and you have the economy, and you have the geography, and you have the diplomacy, and you have the level or the extent in which your measures are being legitimate. This is legitimacy and diplomacy are not the same during the last couple of decades. And the first remark I would like to make that is my suggestion, my own private suggestion, is the component of IT, information technology, should be added as an inherent component or ingredient to the components or ingredients of the national power. Now, the topic is allegedly cyber, and I'm going into IT. And you have to look, and this is because, in my belief, you have to look upon the symbiosis between IT and cyber. Now, all of us know that we are totally dependent upon our IT, unless we are a third world type of a nation or a failing nation. For instance, Somalia does not depend upon its IT capabilities because there are none. These are like the same 6 computers that General Alexander spoke about in North Korea, which are doing quite a hell of a job for 6 sole computers. But if you go to the military, if you go to banking, if you go to insurance, if you go to the stock exchange, if you go to health, if you go to air carriers, once in every couple of months you have an air carrier which is not able to provide its services, and not because something is wrong with the planes, but because all of its computer systems have collapsed. So I believe that, I would say, almost half of the world's nation, this is relevant, or the addition of this component is relevant for them. And the symbiosis between cyber and IT is the fact that if you look upon cyber IT-wise, in an IT perspective, then the defensive parts of cyber are the ones to defend our IT capabilities, and the offensive parts of cyber are the ones that should deprive, if we do withhold within our possession such level of capabilities, they are the ones who can deprive the enemy or the foe or the rival, take whatever articulation you would like to have, of its own IT capabilities. I believe that the main thing to be asked as ourselves, as the mankind, if you would like, is why are we so incognizant to what is so evident, so clear? Now, I'm very glad that General Alexander mentioned the rise in importance and prominence of air power between World War I and World War II, so I'm exempt from it. I want to speak of another example which also belongs to the previous century, and this is the synergy between 3 technological advances, and the first of which is the development and the huge distribution of the internal combustion engine, which led to the mechanization of warfare. No more cavalry, more tanks, more APC. This is one development. Secondly, tactical communication, having radios, having reliable radios. And thirdly, air power. When the Germans added all 3 together, they had the Blitzkrieg. These are the components or the ingredients. So I can go into air power, I can go to arch and bow, I can go to the machine gun of the First World War, but I'm trying to look upon what is the common denominator between all of these type of phenomena of not being able to be cognizant of what is developing in our own eyes. My personal belief is the fact that we as human beings and as institutions, especially the militaries and the DODs or the MODs, those kind of agencies, we tend to have an inbox type of a way of thinking, a linear way of thinking. We somehow think that we would feel a certain need or an urge to have something, and then we would articulate a concept, and then we would go to our technology, to our industries or to our technological leadership and say, okay, there is the need, there is the concept, please make it happen. Where history proves that this goes totally the opposite way. You have a technology, and afterwards you kind of think what you can do with it. Now, I went into some more traditional type of examples, all of them or most of them related to the 20th century. take all of these conclusions, those are my conclusions, and project them to the 21st century and project them to the expedite pace in which IT and cyber is propagating. And you see, and this is my concluding remark, that a nation that will not be able to recognize the importance of IT and cyber as being forged together and to invest the resources and the attention would find itself eventually. I came in the middle of General Alexander's lecture immediately as he was saying that our enemies will fight us via the internet. He said something like that. If a nation does not recognize the importance of IT and cyber and the synergy and the symbiosis between them, this nation would find itself in the same situation the Polish army found itself at the beginning of the Second World War, where its brave cavalry was trying to storm the German tanks and were slaughtered and massacred. Now, slaughtered and massacred digitally is a little bit different than kinetically or traditionally, but still there is a resemblance, if not an identity. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is to talk with Adam Siegel from CFR about some more specific example, because Adam knows a lot about cyber, in particular in the China domain. So what I'm curious, some people I think, probably not in this crowd, but are still interested to know if cyber war is a thing or a myth. You know, but a lot of times we can see, I think, whether that's true or not in practical examples. So Adam, could you tell us a little bit about what the role cyber takes on in Chinese national security philosophy and in any potential conflict scenarios in Asia?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ken. I think, you know, cyber broadly, we know is important to three core security concerns for China: domestic stability and regime legitimacy. So how do you control the internet information coming in and within so you can protect the domestic security? How do you ensure the space economically for Chinese economic growth? And in particular, how do you make sure that you're not dependent on the West for critical technologies? Which explains much of the cyber espionage, but also Chinese efforts to squeeze foreign companies within the Chinese domestic market for transfer technology and to compete with those companies. And then finally, how do you think about cyberspace as a enabler for military conflict? Here we haven't seen the Chinese use those tools. We have a lot of open source writing, which makes it very, very clear that the Chinese see in a hypothetical conflict with a technologically advanced, superior adversary, never named, but of course refers to the United States, that in the first stages of a conflict you want to seize information dominance. Right? That is clearly discussed in Chinese military writing. That will involve a space component, but also clearly involves a cyber component. So there is a very clear need in the very first stages of a conflict to seize those targets and gain information dominance. We also know that the Chinese, at least some Chinese writers, see cyber attacks as having a strategic deterrence. That you could, in fact, attack critical infrastructure in the homeland, which would make the United States rethink security agreements with Taiwan or other allies in the region, which explains why Chinese hackers are in the power grid and other sources of critical infrastructure for preparing the battlefield. Again, haven't seen the Chinese use this. The Chinese haven't fought a war since 1978 against Vietnam, so cyber played no part of that. But we know that they are clearly, their thinking is going to be clearly very hard for the United States or any other potential adversary to control the escalation, right? There's no clear accepted definitions of thresholds, right, between a strategic and a tactical target. Right? What the United States might see as a tactical target, the Chinese could perceive as a strategic target. There have been some indications that command and control networks for nuclear weapons are on the same networks as conventional weapons in China. So you can imagine that an attack from the United States could escalate in ways that we would not expect. The Chinese conception of deterrence is broader than the US conception, right? The Chinese wei shi also involves an aspect of compellence. So a Chinese attack that they see as trying to deter a larger action by the United States might be perceived by the United States as escalatory. Again, so we could have a quick move up the escalatory ladder in ways we didn't want. And then finally, although I understand we're not allowed to say air-sea battle any longer, but given U.S. thinking about how it would also have to seize information dominance early in a conflict, you want to penetrate deep into Chinese networks. You have both sides thinking that there's first mover advantages, right? You want to launch attacks quickly before you lose those capabilities, all of which create further instability for any potential conflict in the region.
Thank you. Let's turn to Herb Lin, who is a brilliant technical mind, but now on the West Coast, in the sunshine in Stanford. What I'd like to know a little bit more is about where would you put your best resources, your money, your investment, and where do you put your faith and your hope for international cybersecurity? Is it on defense or on offense?
Well, that's an interesting question. Let me start by making an interesting observation. Is when you talk about cybersecurity, we almost always talk about it as one word, right? You spell it, there's no space in between cyber and security. And that word has made it into the Oxford English Dictionary. And if you look up the OED definition of cybersecurity, it's purely defensive. It's the things that you do to protect yourself to protect the computer system against unauthorized or whatever use, okay, or intrusions or what have you. And I'm looking right now at a slide here that says, HTTP cyberdefensereview.org, which refers to a West Point journal on cyber doctrine and so on. We always emphasize cybersecurity as a defensive action and so on. But I want to contrast it to cyberspace security with a space in between it. Nobody puts a space between national and security when they talk about national security. That's two words, right? And we all would accept that national security has defensive components and offensive components. And this realization is one that I find is actually controversial for reasons which I don't understand. Military people understand it, policymakers sort of understand it, researchers and activists, academic researchers, of which I'm one, I think I do understand it, but most academic researchers don't understand this, okay? There's a sense in which the notion of offense as a deliberate instrument of national policy is underplayed and somehow delegitimized. Okay, and I want to push back on that. Now there are one of the reasons for this is that national policymakers look at cyber as just one of a number of instruments of national power. We heard that earlier in our leadoff, right? Cyber is one element of military power. Not the only thing. I think actually if you think about offense as a way of defending yourself in cyberspace, there are not very many scenarios under which you would actually find that the ability to conduct offensive operations in cyberspace helps you very much in defending your assets in cyberspace. I've been unable to find very many of those. If somebody here wants to come and challenge me on that, let's have that discussion. But I haven't found very many. Rather, it's from my perspective, it's another instrument to be used. The offensive side is another instrument to be used as an element of military power, as to the extent that we use military power as one of the elements of exerting national power around the world. Now, it's true that all nations say that we want we want a peaceful cyberspace, and we don't want to be attacked, that's all that's true. But what they really mean by that is we don't want cyber weapons to be used against us, but we want to be able to use it against them, whoever the them is. That's real, and that's the contradiction. That's the tension. The activist community, much of the academic research community will just say, no, we shouldn't be engaged in attack or offensive operations at all, period, end of discussion. But national governments, of which the U.S. is one, has one, say no. We want to be able to hack the bad guys too. We want to be defended against the bad guys. Well, we also want to be able to hack the bad guys. Now, is that contradictory? Well, I mean, governments have contradictory goals. I mean, that's not a surprise that you would want to be able to do that. We don't just give cops bulletproof vests, right? We give them guns too. The intent is the overall intent is defensive, but sometimes we believe that cops need guns, just like nations need offensive capabilities to prosecute their national security interests. So where I come out on this is, yes, a defense dominant, we should try to strengthen our defenses, and that will have incidental effects on strengthening everybody else's defenses too, and that's fine. But that we should be, that offense really does play a meaningful role in our national security posture, but not for the reasons which is usually stated, which is it's not to protect our cyberspace, it's just to be another part of the toolkit that we can use to advance national objectives.
Thank you, Herb. And I'm going to give the $64,000 question, which is next one, to Jim Lewis of CSIS, which is, what do you do in response to a cyber attack? So we've seen some big ones lately, right? In terms of DNC and NSA, and not only that, but the electricity grid attack in Ukraine, for example, and sort of a proliferation and evolution of cyber attacks. But what do you do when you get hit with one of these things? What's the best response?
Well, first of all, I met last week with a senior Russian analyst who wanted me to assure Amerikansky friends it is not Russia doing DNC hack. How could we think this? And it's like I told him, well, we're just naturally paranoid, kind of like you. And I think it's a good point to start with on this with Russia, because Russia, starting with the conflict in Serbia, where even before perhaps, but certainly with Serbia, began to think about how do I circumvent the areas where the U.S. is strong? How do I avoid a direct conflict with the U.S. and yet still use coercion, if not force, to achieve my political goals? And so they've been thinking about this for about 20 years, and they've actually done pretty well, right? It fits into our question about what is a proportional response to something like this. And of course, the motto of the national security establishment in the United States is lawyer up. So it's a thing. The proportional response can delay any retaliation or by the U.S. to a cyber attack, but there's some good reasons for that. The first is that proportional response helps you control the risk of escalation, and this is when you talk to people in the National Command Authority. Their two immediate questions are you sure it was them, attribution? And if you say yes to that, then they say, how will you manage the escalation if we do something back, right? So these are two boxes you have to check, and proportional response helps check them. Proportional response by itself is not a good way to think about this, because a lot of times people put this in the context of sort of tit for tat. They hacked the DNC, we'll do something back. The North Koreans hacked a movie chain, we'll hack their movie chain. It's like, it can't be tit for tat. It has to be part of a broader strategy, right? Sometimes people talk about name and shame. For me, name and shame is one of those code words that tells me that whoever says it doesn't know what they're talking about. You're going to shame Vladimir Putin? Good luck. Let me know how that's going to work, right? I mean, there were some of these discussions, like, suppose we put pictures of his girlfriends on the internet. And I was like, well, which one, right? Or suppose we reveal that he's corrupt. It's like, it's hard to come up with a proportional response to things that are not the normal kinetic, forceful activities. And the Russians have thought carefully, and I think some of our other opponents have thought carefully too, about how do I avoid the tripwires that the Americans have laid out, and they've done pretty well at it. So we need to define, we have we're lacking two things when you talk about proportional response. The first is we haven't linked responses to escalation. We don't have what some people call an escalatory ladder. So they do this, we do that. You have to have a broader context to put proportional response in. The second thing is we don't have a broader strategy for dealing with Russia and other opponents. Whatever we were doing in the past doesn't work anymore, right? And so we had 25 years after the end of the Cold War where the US was kind of unchallenged and could do whatever it's wanted. Those days are over. So we need a new kind of strategy for dealing with these opponents, right? And I think that might be a good place to stop. So think about how you link proportional response to escalation, and think about how you fit it into a broader strategy to control or counter your opponents. And today's big opponent, I said this to the Chinese, I met with the people from the embassy, and I told them I was sorry. They were now in second place as the bad guys. And they didn't like that. I was like, but they are in second place.
They wanted to advance?
Yeah, I know. It's like, what happened? So strategy and escalation. Think about that for proportional response.
Terrific answer. Thank you. So back to Israel, and I'd like to hear a little bit about Israel in this context. But I think the next question would be, in the internet era, you can imagine that we're thinking peace is going to be easier, post-conflict, diplomacy and resolution, however you put it. Or, can I turn off my opponent's, military before it actually reaches the field of battle? Something. But the internet era in cyberspace, is it going to make a more peaceful era or a more conflict-prone era? And is it going to contribute to the escalation or moderation of conflict in human affairs?
Thank you. Escalation or moderation. First of all, this is an open question. Our late president, Shimon Peres, who passed away 2 weeks ago, he had a habit for which he paid a price in the Israeli public opinion. When he was asked, not as a president, there he was a consensus, when he was still an active politician, when he was asked to say something clear, but this something he was supposed to express his opinion about was complex, like most things in life, then he used to say, okay, it's a yes, and advocate for the yes, but it's a no, and then advocate for the no. So this is an open question, yet to be determined. It's a yes and no, but I would like to say a couple of things. The first of which is the fact that I believe, cannot ignore the fact that the general nature of conflicts, of global conflicts, is changing right in front of our eyes. My personal belief, and I'm not a scholar I'm an ardent historian, I'm not a scholar of history or political science, is that the era of the clashing Napoleonic industrial militaries is gone. It will not come back for the next couple of decades. The conflicts we have nowadays, most if not all of them, are either ideology or religion driven. They are longer, maybe never ending. You can't have a peace treaty or a ceasefire or an armistice with Al-Qaeda or ISIS. You just can't have it. So it's a never-ending type of a conflict. You have organizations and militias within the global arena. It's not state versus vis-a-vis state. It's not a nation vis-a-vis a nation. You have organizations and militias. And this is where it comes to express itself in the cyber realm. This is a multi-dimensional type of a set of conflicts. This is kinetic or traditional, and this is cybernetic. This is under-terrestrial, this is information warfare, this is incitement, this is social media, this is everything. And I believe we haven't defined to ourselves what is this evolving nature of conflicts. What are the specific characteristics of cyber within this turmoil or within this havoc? When you speak about cyber, there is the attribution factor. I mean, it's not easy, it's not impossible, but it's not easy. It's not as clear as evident as the old conflicts in which everything was so clear and the enemies were so clear right in front of your eyes. If you are being targeted or you are being attacked or some preparations for the attack are being made, someone is hacking you, someone is preparing an army of botnets. He hasn't attacked you yet, but the botnets are proliferated into your own networks. Then there is an issue, a huge issue of attribution. Now, the other side of attribution is deniability. If there is no attribution, then what you think or what your intel tells you that this is the potential attacker or the attacker, he can deny or he must not take responsibility upon his action. So if there is attribution and there is a potential of deniability, then I'd say as a first order type of an observation, it might not be a true one, but as a first order, that this has a moderating effect, because if there is deniability and there is no taking over the response, then there has to be no retaliation, right? But this is also so theoretical. What I would like to say in that regard, that the question of whether this contributes to moderation or escalation remains to be seen. I like to point out upon two, maybe three prominent factors, which in my view will be the ones determining in future to come whether this will be moderating or escalating. First of all, would this equation or balance between attribution, deniability, and not taking retaliation steps can be maintained? Now, as I've mentioned before, this is a very theoretical type of an example, but if some politician from the attacking side opens his mouth and even leaks some information for his own political reasons, then the attribution is solved, there is no deniability, and retaliatory steps have to be taken. So this is a kind of a very, very delicate balance or equation. This is one factor. Secondly, there has to be some bilateral balance or some reciprocity between both sides. For instance, if you attack cybernetically a nation which doesn't have any kind of offensive cyber capabilities, what would they do? They would attack you kinetically. So maybe this is an absurd, don't take me seriously. Maybe it's good for you to have them for them to have some cybernetic capabilities, because then this would leave potentially the conflict under some level of not going kinetics. But the issue of reciprocity and bilateral capabilities or balance of bilateral capabilities is something that has to be considered. Thirdly, the level of damage inflicted. The level of damage inflicted by cybernetic attacks is determined by the side who was attacked, not by the attacker. This is against military mentality. This is against military education and military way of thinking. We are used to think upon the effects of what we are doing. We are bombing here, we are destroying this, we are coercing, we are whatever. This is against our nature. The level of damage will be determined by the guy you attacked him, because this is not kinetic. This is not some water dam or some power plant related to the power grid that goes off. This is not tangible. So this will be determined by him. And fourthly, and this is, I would say, the most random factor of all, there is, of course, the personality of the leadership, the attacked leadership, and the culture. There are some cultures and some leaders who might have the blow, might hide behind the deniability and the non-attribution and not retaliate. Try this with Putin or Erdogan, really bad-tempered. Don't try this with Putin or Erdogan, and there are, or with this guy from North Korea. So this is also a factor. My concluding remark is the fact that, as I've said, this is yet to be seen. My personal belief is that it will have potentially, and I hope this is on record, right? Everything is taped and everything. So if I'm saying, I'm trying to predict the future, this is so dangerous. Better be a journalist. My personal belief is that this might have given the fulfillment of some other conditions a more moderating than escalating type of an effect, because some of the conflicts, and they are, as I've said, damage, culture, personality driven or dependent, some of the conflicts might remain or might stay under the kinetic or under the traditional kinetic threshold. And the last sentence I would like to say is that we, in view or in light of the appearance of cyber as a prominent factor or a prominent player, we need to investigate. We need to go through all of our system of terms, of our terminology, of our strategy. For instance, retaliation and deterrence and preemption. We knew very well, the Americans knew very well what they meant in the 50s. Those were terms that were developed throughout the 50s here within the Beltway by think tanks in view of the bipolar world and the mutual assured destruction. What is the meaning of those terms when you come to speak with them cyber-wise? All of this needs to be reopened, needs to be revised, and I believe we have a conceptual gap. We have a conceptual gap. The Russians, and this is truly my last comment, when you look upon the way they acted in Ukraine, in Estonia, in Georgia, in some other places, look at the Baltics, look at Finland. They're acting in Finland as well. Not everything is very explicit. Most of it is tacit, is illicit. The way they combine their kinetic efforts, their cybernetic efforts, the way they have their concepts and their strategic and operational thinking, the way they integrate information warfare and deception into one synergized type of an effort, I believe in that regard, they are a couple of years ahead of the West, and that includes the United States, that includes Israel, that includes NATO. They are a couple of years ahead of us. And this is a gap we have to fulfill from the conceptual level until the technical ability to execute or to prosecute what we would like to achieve. Thank you.
So when I was about 15 years ago reading log files in the basement of the Pentagon, trying to figure out who was targeting the U.S. Navy and why and what they were getting, so on and so forth, the main issue was China. It was sort of China and everybody else, really, as far as cyber espionage goes. And then some of what we were looking at is, could there be enough tactical wins in cyber espionage to make strategic wins? So for a long time, China was the player. But it also seems like, even our heads of state have discussed this issue and tried to figure out how to address it between the two nations. But Adam, where do we stand in terms of finding a modus vivendi in cyberspace between the US and China?
Well, I wish I was there when you told them they were number 2. Because that would have been, especially to the Russians, that would have meant.
I didn't tell them they were number 2.
Oh, okay.
So they're not.
On the espionage side, at least on the industrial espionage side, from the publicly revealed information from FireEye and I think CrowdStrike as well, the attacks on the private sector seem to be going down or have gone down dramatically. I think both FireEye and CrowdStrike have left open the possibility that Chinese hackers have just gotten better, right? Since what the kind of traditional characterization of Chinese hackers was, I think, probably best summed up by FBI Director Comey, that they were like the drunk burglar who knocked over your vase as they took your TV. So they didn't seem to be particularly concerned with being caught or what they took or how much they took. But the instances of espionage directed at intellectual property and business secrets to the private sector seems to have gone down rather dramatically. Was that the result of naming and shaming, as Jim doesn't want me to say, or the indictment of the 5 PLA officers, or I think probably most likely the threat of sanctions through the executive order, just as President Xi Jinping was arriving to the US for his first summit, which was incredibly important to him for domestic political reasons, and the Chinese had an incentive to sign that so they didn't derail the summit, or are there domestic reasons, right? Is there, in part, reasons to control the theft of intellectual property for the anti-corruption campaign, right? You don't want hackers, especially tied to the PLA, using state resources for private gain. Does it have to do with the greater consolidation of cyber forces that seems to be happening under the creation of the strategic support forces? So we both have internal and domestic reasons to have some, what seems to be some downturn on the industrial espionage reason. That said, the Chinese have plenty of reasons to continue to do the hacking that you were investigating, directed at political and military targets. And the evidence there seems to be that it is still continuing. There's an article in the Financial Times today about spear phishing to visitors to US carrier groups right before the findings in the International Tribune in the South China Sea. So I don't think we have any reason to think that that will go down. And in many ways, that's what that was the signal the United States was sending, right? There is good hacking, which is the hacking the US tends to be particularly good at, political military hacking, and there's bad hacking, which is directed at intellectual property. And that's what we want the Chinese to reduce. Chinese not only signed the agreement with us, but they also signed it with the UK. This year, they'll probably release a similar agreement with Germany, and they signed it with the G7 and the G20. So it's been some progress, I think, in internationally kind of creating that norm against industrial property theft. Political military espionage will continue, and also Chinese espionage against civilian and non-state actors. So human rights groups, politicians in Hong Kong, and others, all of that will continue and will continue to push out and I think be prominent. I think an interesting question for us, to go to the kind of proportional response that Jim asked, comes up with the OPM hack occasionally, right? So with the hack of the Office of Personnel Management, in many ways, that was the type of target that the United States was signaling was legitimate, right, for political and military reasons. And DNI Clapper said that, that would be the type of target that the U.S. would go after. And I think he even used the phrase, "I tip my hat to the Chinese for going after that." But I think there has been some argument that the scale of the opium hack is somehow out of bounds, right? That under Moscow rules, we kind of had some acceptable bounds of of espionage, but cyber somehow breaks that boundary, right? Because you can take gigabytes, terabytes of data and take it for, not just 50 diplomats, 100 diplomats, but for 22 million people. So the question is, do you want to create some type of response to suggest there's a type of espionage within a certain constraint? I don't see that happening, but I think it would be very difficult for the United States to do.
So I'd like to take the discussion toward Jim now. A few years ago, I was asked to give a couple of cyber lectures in Baghdad. So I said, okay. And flew there and got into the airport, and then we went on a Black Hawk across the city. And the Black Hawk was completely black, no lights on, everybody's dressed sort of in black, except for the couple of analysts. And as we get about halfway over the city, all of a sudden, seemingly the world ended. Everything went from black to the brightest white I have ever seen in my life. What is this? This is countermeasures, right? Proactive, reactive, nobody knows. I don't know anyway, only the crew. But what do you do in the face of this threat, whether it's a real attack or a threat of an attack? You take some sort of countermeasures and you develop a series of countermeasures to to defend yourself. And so, Jim, what about countermeasures in cyberspace? What do they look like, and what kind of countermeasures are best?
You know, at CSIS, we have on the 4th or 5th floor, we have a shrine to Cold War concepts. It's a replica of a petrified tree. And I think it's an appropriate token, because sometimes I worry that our strategic thinking is petrified because we're kind of welded into these Cold War concepts that don't really make sense anymore. Right? So when you talk about deterrence, for example, a phrase that I dislike almost as much as I dislike name and shame, you know, what do we actually mean? If you're thinking about deterring an opponent, though, if you're going to step back, what the U.S. uses is what they would call an all tools of government approach, right? Which means not just the military, not just the intelligence agencies, but the Department of Justice, as Adam said, with indictments and sanctions. The indictments had a profound effect on the Chinese. They hated them. And with Treasury and the ability to sanction. So we have a range of tools. There's diplomatic tools you could use. So there's 4 or 5 agencies that the president can draw upon. One of the issues that comes up with the idea of how you use countermeasures is the still relatively porous definition of use of force and armed attack. And these are, of course, key phrases out of the UN Charter. The way relations among major powers work now is that they have technically forsworn the use of force except for self-defense in response to an armed attack, right? And there's a whole set of things they have to go through, right? And there's been efforts in the UN to precisely define armed attack and use of force. And weirdly enough, the Russians, the Americans, the British, and the Chinese all agreed, we don't want a precise definition. I know because I wrote it, and I thought it was brilliant, and they all shot it down in about 20 seconds. They don't want a precise definition of armed attack. They want some ability to be flexible in how they respond to some sort of malicious cyber activity. And this gets us back to the all tools approach, right? And it gets us back to proportional response. If you can't decide whether something is an armed attack, that kind of precludes the use of force, at least overtly. What do you do then? Which of the tools do you select? I think that when we look at countermeasures, which you could roughly define as retaliatory acts not involving the use of force, right? So a nation is allowed to take countermeasures when something like the DNC hack occurs, right? As a response, as retaliation, doesn't involve the use of force. And sometimes that's hard for Americans to get their hard heads around. I mean, one of the debates on the response to the DNC hack is we should, unleash Cyber Command, which probably won't happen. And if it did happen, it might not have any effect, or it might not have the effect we want. So that's why countermeasures are in some ways attractive. People need to think. But they relate very much to this definition of what is the use of force and what is an armed attack. And we have implicit understandings of that. If it is equivalent in effect to a kinetic attack, then we say yes. The US codified this in a 2013 speech by then Secretary of Defense Panetta, where he said if there was physical effect, physical damage, if there was civilian casualties, and if there was damage to the economic well-being of the United States, we would regard that. He set a threshold there that kind of loosely defined what we would regard as justifying the use of force in response. Our opponents, good news is they paid attention, They didn't stop, but they paid attention, so they've been very careful to avoid doing anything that would trigger the use of force, which makes it incumbent on us to devise countermeasures, to define countermeasures. On name and shame, I'll just mention that one. Name and shame only works if you tie it to consequences. And so one of the debates for the last 4 years or so, starting a year before the sanctions on the PLA members, is how do you create consequences for malicious action in cyberspace, right? And one approach, of course, would be to use force, but that's largely off the table for a whole set of reasons we can talk about later. And then you have to say, okay, how do I get consequences? Is it sanctions? Is it indictments? And that's a large part of the debate here, is I need to be able to let opponents know that one, I have the ability to attribute now much more effectively than I did, say, a decade ago. So you're not invisible anymore. That was a lot of the noise about Sony, was to signal to all the folks that they aren't visible anymore. What we didn't expect is the Russians don't care that they're not invisible. But one, you want to signal you're not invisible. And two, you want to signal that we thought of ways to penalize you to retaliate for your malicious action. So that's really where countermeasures come in, is we need this all tools approach, and a bit better defined than we have now, in order to start changing opponent calculations.
Thank you. To Israel again, Uzi, Israel has a very advanced technological sector, but also lives in a difficult security environment between Syria and collapse, ISIS, Turkey, as was mentioned already this morning by the general, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. This is a tough part of the world. And I would think that Israel has a good reason to have such advanced IT capabilities. So what can you share with us from Israel's experience as advice for other nations?
First of all, one has to be very careful, very prudent when giving advice or lessons to other nations. One has to keep his modesty and humbleness. So I'll try to give some takeaways which aren't necessarily duplicable when you try to recap or to copy them to other realities. And as far as you've described the Middle East with the so bleak reality of the Arab Spring, we usually think of ourselves as it's quite a nice townhouse. I mean, we have our problems and issues and challenges in a very, very bad neighborhood. So we like to keep the kids locked at home. We'd like to keep all doors closed. And once in a while, we have to teach the neighbors some lessons, because this is truly a bad neighborhood. When the Arab Spring, so to speak, erupted, I was attending at the time the U.S. Army War College. This was 2010, yes, the class of 2010. And of course, I became immediately the scholar for the Middle East, because I was an Israeli, evidently from the neighborhood. And I was asked, I mean, everyone, faculty as well, Aaron, was very, very optimistic, because everyone saw the potential of the flourishing Jeffersonian type of democracy in the Middle East. And I was kind of walking bleak within the corridors of the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, until I got fed up from the questions and from the pessimistic type of forecasts. And I had to say that having a more realistic, less optimistic, more bleak type of forecast proved itself to be a little bit more true than the other. Anyhow, I'm getting back to cyber. I'd like to speak about two topics. I can speak for an hour or so, but we don't have ample time. The first of which you would be surprised or not, shouldn't be surprised, is the manpower. Manpower. I believe this was Clinton, not Hillary, Bill, who in the 1992 campaign said it's all about the economy, right? It's all the economy, something like that. It's all about the manpower and the skills of the manpower. Now, this might seem as a very general headline. Who objects to have very high quality manpower? Everyone is in favor. But let me try and exemplify this throughout a personal example from the last role I had as the J6. Israel is a small nation. I mean, the population of Israel is similar to the 5 boroughs of New York City, roughly 8 million people. This is roughly the number. I, as the J6, throughout the little less than 5 years tenure I held, owned, so to speak, 60 plus classes of high school graduates. When I say own them, that means that I initiated them, I financed them, I had an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, a technological non-commissioned officer, stationed or positioned at each of these classes. And you might not be impressed by the 60 plus number, but to a nation the size of Israel, this is a big number. My peer, the J2, because cyber within the IDF is divided between J6 and J2. My peer, J2, held even a bigger number than this, and we invested in those classes. Those were classes in which electronics, computer science, some cyber hacking education was given, and priority by the chief of staff, in contrast to his nature and in contrast to my nature, because both of us, the chief of staff and myself, were field officers. So if a guy can go to the fighting echelons or to the fighting units, he should go over there. But priority was given, and a graduate of these specific classes, even if he had the set skill and the desire to be a commando fighter in Sayeret Matkal, which is the equivalent of say, SAS and some other special units within the US military, he would go to cyber or he would go to computer science, because this was the priority set by the general staff, which I was a member of. I can go into numerous other examples of how to encourage, how to give grants to faculties, high school, formal and informal education, but everything in the cyber realm is manpower, manpower, manpower. Secondly, and I believe this is even more important, and this is something which can be done only in a nation like Israel, where you have a compulsory service. Each and every high school graduate, males and females, are enlisted to the military, whether this is by law and by will, because the motivation to serve is on the rise because of the reality of the tough. We don't force them to come; they want to come, and they want to serve their nation. That means that at the age of 18, we get the best of the best, the creme de la creme of the manpower of the reservoir, and we can have our processes. But this is only one pillar, the military. The other three pillars are, of course, the education system, which I've mentioned, not only the military type of classes, but the education system, the industry, and the academia. And all of those 4 pillars lie upon what is a little less tangible, but I would like to relate to as well, a very, very type of a flat culture. Israel is a very, very there is no respect to authority, and this is a good thing. This is a good thing, I'm telling you. As a general, a couple of years ago, I was asked to escort, because of the English, I was asked reluctantly to escort the British chief of staff. He had a visit in Israel, and we went to the Golan Heights, and I'm standing at a given hill at the Golan Heights, and I'm explaining that this took place here, and this is this, and this is that, whatever. I mean, you know the procedure. And this young sergeant, maybe 19 years old, he comes to me and he says, Uzi, he doesn't even call me by rank. He says, Uzi, this is nonsense what you're saying. I mean, this is totally untrue. And he was right. And the British chief of staff was totally shocked by the way he even addressed me, not by rank, by name, and by the content of what he said. But it was no big deal, because then I was a brigadier, I think, at the age of 45, 46 years old, 26 or 27 years before, I was that same sergeant coming to a general and say, oh my God, this is what the Brits would say, this is utterly rubbish, right? So this lies on a very, very flat type of a level and on a spirit of entrepreneurship. 10 days ago, I was in San Francisco, the Silicon Valley, some business, and I was there for 4 days, maybe 5 days, time gap between the two coasts. I could speak Hebrew. I could speak Hebrew for all week, almost all week long. I chose not to. Because of the extent of the Israeli entrepreneurs being very prosperous there over the Silicon Valley. So if you look upon the ecosystem, these are the 4 pillars: the military, the compulsory service system, the culture of lack of respect to hierarchy, the entrepreneurship, the industry, and the academia. And everything is related because this professor of computer science in the Technion in Haifa or in Tel Aviv's university, he's probably a reservist of 8,200. So he will do like a 2 or 3 weeks a year period within 8,200, and then he would go back to the faculty. So everything is interrelated. And my last comment is that this ecosystem, because we have no respect to authority and a very, very flat type of a culture, wasn't created by a top-down process. There is no executive order by the PM or some governmental decision ordering that there would be an Israeli ecosystem, and this would be the interrelations between the components or the ingredients of it. It just evolved, and it proves itself to be, at least for now, very, very successful and contributing. So this is very, very specific to Israel, and I really don't know what can be totally duplicated into other nations or other realities, but these are the main 2 takeaways I want you to take out of this part. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. And this is the last question before we turn it over to the floor, which goes to Stanford and Herblin, and it's about the future. I think the future was probably always hard to predict, but the internet and cyberspace and basically, we're in a point now where we're worried about the singularity, right? And the unknown that could be just around the corner. So I'd like to ask you about a decade from now, what are your thoughts on where we'll be for international cybersecurity?
James Clapper actually answered that question in 2015. I think he has more or less the same answer now, which is that this is paraphrasing, but rather than cyber Armageddon, the intelligence community predicts a series of low to moderate impact cyber events, which will collectively impose cumulative costs on the U.S. economy and security and so on. And I actually don't see very much of what's going on that could change that. Now, there are possibilities of changing that. I'm on this presidential commission that's supposed to articulate a plan to help, a roadmap to help us get to a situation that's much better, and I hope that plan that we articulated is going to be successful. No, I can't tell you what's in it yet. We're still working on it. But I personally foresee that the environment is only going to get worse in the sense that there are going to be more players banging on us. One of the most interesting things about cyber weapons, about weapons in the last weapons development over the last 30 years or so, is that we've tried to make them less and less powerful. That is, more and more discriminating, less and less collateral damage, and so on, more and more, and therefore more and more usable. So you can and the scale of damage that a cyber weapon can inflict, is essentially infinitely scalable. So you can do essentially nothing with it, or almost nothing with it, up to something very large. And given that they are so usable, I think that the temptation to use them for various reasons, whatever your government, our government, somebody else's government, and so on, might want to use them for, is going to be irresistible. So I foresee capabilities proliferating, not just in national governments, but in the private sector too. And of course, there are going to be national governments that are just going to be able to buy their cyber capabilities from the private sector. So I think a whole lot more threat actors out there, and we have to get our act together if we're going to have any chance of being more resilient against that kind of a threat.
Thank you. Okay, now this is the good part for you, is you get to raise your hand and ask questions. Hopefully you've thought of some ideas that we haven't considered between the panelists on the stage. And so I do give the floor to you. And Tom Wingfield, terrific. You're the first question.
Thank you. Tom Wingfield, National Defense University. I have to speak into the microphone.
Thank you very much. First of all, Ken, thank you, and thank you to the panelists. That was absolutely fascinating, and you're right. It was a 1947's Yankee lineup. This is marvelous to see all of you there. My question is directed initially toward Jim, but anyone else who wants to take a bite, I'd love to hear what you say, because I'll be feeding off of that with my students for the next year. The question is, what is it that senior decision makers don't grasp about attribution as clearly as they should, whether it's the degree of certainty that's needed or the uncertainty about that, the degree of state involvement, at the unclassified level, various entities' ability to do that? What is most misunderstood about attribution that you can talk about here that would help us clarify our own thinking about this issue? Thanks.
Well, yeah, it was
Speak as the spirit moves you.
All right. The thing that I think is hardest for policymakers to understand on that is attribution. High confidence attribution is slow. That is, you don't get it immediately, and the effects of a cyber attack on you are going to be manifest a lot sooner than a high confidence judgment of who did it and why they did it. Attribution is much more possible than it used to be. There's no question about that. So and one of the reasons for that is that over the past 10 years, we've been paying a lot of attention to it. So there's a lot of recorded data that we can compare it to. There's a lot of historical experience where we're getting better at it and so on. So it's nowhere nearly as hopeless as it's often portrayed in the research community. Nevertheless, knowing who it is quickly is tough. I will point out that there is, if you do a Google search on me, on Herb Lin, and attribution on the SSRN network, Social Science Research Network, ssrn.com, you'll get a very comprehensive review paper on attribution, which discusses all of these issues in great detail.
So maybe two thoughts. The first is, I'm sort of experiential, so I'm not sure it's right, but when I was a child, there weren't as many lawyers involved in making decisions. You had the sort of pre-decision phase, you had the pre-operational phase where you had lawyers and they gave you advice. You had operations, lawyers weren't involved. And then you had the post-operation review where you mainly had to persuade the lawyers that you'd paid attention to what they said in the pre-operational phase. And now it appears to me that we have lawyers involved in the operational phase, right? And that's a change, it appears. Not 100% sure, but that raises the question then of evidentiary standards, because the evidentiary standards that you need for, say, a legal decision or for to pacify lawyers is going to be higher, and that imposes constraints on your ability to take action. So that's sort of I've been talking about that with a few people, and it's sort of a sense we have that it might just be, is it a permanent change that we're more legalistic, or is it something else? The second thing that's interesting is, as I think all of us have said, is the US has put a lot of effort into improving its attribution capabilities, and you probably all know there's one line in this 2015 State of the Union address that tells you how we do it, the secret sauce, in very general terms. The dilemma internationally is that most other countries don't have that capability. The Russians may have it, not using the same secret sauce that we have. Mm-hmm. And so you get a lot of countries saying, like I was talking to a small European power, well, they don't have a clue, right? Maybe they can eventually hire a company like Mandiant or something, But this disparity in capabilities, to do really good attribution, you need a very robust intelligence system. And most countries don't have that, right? And so that makes it hard then to negotiate, because you say things like, it was them. For some reason, people don't always take us at our word anymore. I don't know why. But, you know, how do we, that's, I think, one of the big problems is how do you make a persuasive international case? And then what are the evidentiary standards you need to guide operations? Should it, you know, what is the weight of the sort of the legal approach to this?
Gentlemen, Jerry Landrum from the Asymmetric Warfare Group. Some international relations scholars consider sovereignty kind of an organized hypocrisy. In other words, it's a tool that states use when they want to, but then they disregard it in cases like Libya or Serbia or something like that. As I listen to you guys talk, it seems like that in the cyber domain, because of fear of escalation and the inability to attribute, that the idea of sovereignty is really in that domain, that there is no sovereignty principle associated with that. Is that accurate? I mean, is it in the cyber domain, is there no sovereignty, no national sovereignty?
Well, I mean, the Chinese have, I think, are you know, they're high priests in the Church of Realpolitik, and they still embrace sovereignty in all of its forms, and they believe that you can exert it in cyberspace, right? So they have this conception of cyber sovereignty or internet sovereignty, which is basically that states are going to exert their influence over cyber like they do air, sea, space, everywhere else. And so I think that's been one of the conflicts with the United States, is that we have, you know, fairly consistently, besides the organized hypocrisy part of it, is that the cyberspace or the internet is a global platform, right, for the free flow of information and ideas, and that if you try to create walls, not only are you going to, you know, hurt the free flow of information, but you're going to hurt yourself, right? You don't realize that this is in your economic interest, but if you try to control and regulate, it's in the long term not in your own interest. Well, the Chinese and the Russians and lots of other countries don't see it that way. So I would say that no, in fact, lots of countries see a reason to organize cyber around sovereignty and are trying to do that.
So go ahead.
Yes, as I've said earlier, I advocated for the fact that we need not only to refurbish a little bit our set of concepts and terminology, but to really re-examine them. The concept of sovereignty is so clear in air, land, and sea. In space, you have some issues over there, but there are 5, maybe 6 nations in the world who have the capability to even argue on what is space sovereignty. But air, land, and sea, this is so clear. When it comes to cyberspace, because this is all too flat and the infrastructures are so flat and so global in nature, we lack a definition of sovereignty. This is the whole nations of the world, and there were some attempts to put some lines to it. For instance, the Budapest Accords, which were articulated like 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, they were insufficient, inadequate, and there is no complacency because there is no enforcement and no rules of engagement. So there is a very between obscure and non-existent definition, and I think in regard you have pointed out a very, very true and painful, potentially painful point. A speech made by Panetta about 2 years ago, which you have mentioned, I've heard it. It wasn't a definition of sovereignty. It was a definition or an attempt to define some red lines. That means that you can infringe sovereignty and still not cross the red lines. So this is not a definition of sovereignty. This is a thing that really has to come into our minds, because we're so right in observing that there is no definition, no borders. When there is no borders, there is no definition of trespassing those borders. So it's you know, it's an ungoverned space, literally.
I thought we were going to agree, and now I think we're going to disagree. So this may come as a newsflash to you, but in 2013, the United States agreed, along with all the other members of the UN General Assembly, that national sovereignty applies to cyberspace. By the way, they reaffirmed that agreement in 2015. And sometimes people say, well, I want to write that down, I want it to be precise. And as we were talking about with use of force and armed attack, people who run governments don't always want to be precise. They want to have that flexibility. So what I've heard from, say, our British colleagues is, why should my definition of sovereignty in cyberspace be any more precise than my definition in the real world? One of the big changes that led to this agreement in 2013 was a realization that the initial thinking we had about cyberspace, that it was a global commons, was just goofy. It's not a global commons. I realize that there's some appeal to writing QDRs based around defending the global commons, but it doesn't make any sense, right? And the rest of the world doesn't like the idea of a global commons because they think that's us giving us license to be the hegemon in the global commons. There are borders in cyberspace because it's based on a physical infrastructure. It's a man-made construct. Is it precise? Is it accurate? No. But sovereign states are still the most powerful actor. I was at a lunch with somebody from Google who told me that Google had the same capabilities as NSA. And I said, that's amazing. I had no idea that you guys had nuclear submarines and satellites, right? Well, they don't, of course. States are the most powerful actors. States are the ones who retain the capabilities. States are the focus of sovereignty. So what we're in a period now of, in the internet writ large, including internet governance, is defining sovereignty. Nations are extending sovereignty. They're not putting a big flag up that says this is sovereignty. They're saying data localization, they're saying privacy rules, they're saying cybersecurity requirements. But nations are extending sovereignty, and as they do that, they are beginning to define it. It'll be a long process, so I agree with you that there's a starting point, but we're down the path of saying sovereignty applies, and it's no more hypocritical in cyberspace than it is in any other domain. Is that a good thing?
Afternoon, Bill Whitman from Air Force Research Lab up in Rome, New York. You heard some mention this morning about the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge and the computers and doing autonomous defensive operations. With the push in autonomy towards creating systems, structures, and devices which can, on their own, select and determine a course of action, they need to be granted authority to do something other than just an automated function. And that requires trust. We also heard this morning that one of the big problems with a lot of stuff with cyber is establishing trust in our Internet of Things, our devices, our tools, our data even. So with autonomy and autonomous systems, capabilities of doing things on their own, where do you see breakdowns between different countries, regions, in how they employ autonomous or truly automated functions in conducting operations and doing things through cyberspace, with delegating authority, and then how do they handle assigning a responsibility to an individual or to something for when there's a consequence or an action that takes place that maybe not have been foreseen or was foreseen and went wrong, like in a kinetic strike, but how that would be handled through cyberspace.
The DARPA program that you're referring to only was restricted its autonomous or automated response to a domain which was internal to it. That is, nobody, if you're attacked, nobody will argue with your right to do something to your own system. The only issues that come up really in the sense that you're talking about, is when you intend to create effects outside your organizational control, outside your border. I mean, however you want to define it, outside your borders, outside your legal authority, what have you. And in fact, that reason That fact is that when you go outside of the purview of your control, that's where it really gets dicey. Those are policy decisions, and at this point, those actions that go beyond your borders are really tightly held. Don't know what other nations are doing, but I think that's the right posture.
So I was thinking about this the other day, that, so an autonomous weapon is basically, there's an algorithm at the core of it that makes decisions, right? And there's no reason, I thought initially, that you couldn't write into that algorithm the requirements under international humanitarian law, proportionality, distinction, discrimination. But the devices we have now are still too coarse in their ability to make judgments that there would not be situations where, even though you program them to follow IHL, they would confront situations that they would be unable to make a decision. And so they would either make the wrong decision or they would short out. Adam might have views on this too, but I don't know if other countries, who are the leaders in this kind of thing? Well, Israel's one, Korea's one, China's one, and the Chinese are kind of like an American IT company. They're really good at press releases, so I know they've put out that they've got, what is it, some sort of missile that's
Cruise
like
missile, but
AI.
it wasn't.
Yeah, it's like, sure, yeah. But I wonder to the extent, and I don't know what you think, Adam, do they worry about the following international law? And I don't say this in a pejorative way. Do they have the same concerns about following international law and the requirements that we do?
Yeah, I don't actually quite honestly know the answer for autonomous vehicles and AI. I can only draw from other areas for biotechnology, right, where they pushed ahead in lots of spaces where US ethicists and others said we should not be conducting research in these areas. So my default would be no, they are going to build the systems, then maybe worry about the ethics afterwards.
Okay, perhaps one final question. Do we have next?
Yes. Hi, Sean Lonergan at the Army Cyber Institute. Several of you spoke. Several of you spoke about a concern about inadvertent conflict escalation. I'm curious what escalation dominance looks like to you in cyberspace and if it's actually feasible.
It has never been tried before, that's for sure.
Well, one of the questions is to what extent, I think Uzi touched on this and maybe Adam too, cyber is kind of blending with other sort of effects producing capabilities, and the one I'm more interested in is with electronic warfare. And so if you start to think about how you blend cyber and EW to, I don't know what you want to call it, active EW or whatever, then you'd want to think about, if I do something in cyberspace, when does it bleed over into this other domain? Sometimes people talk about cross-domain deterrence. I was originally a believer in that some years ago. I don't believe in it anymore, partially because it's hard to define what a proportional response is, and partially because cross-domain may be inadvertently escalatory. So I think one of the things we have to work through is, as we use this tool in a conflict, when you're using a blended capability, escalation isn't as big a problem. But, go ahead.
I'd like to correct myself. When I said that this hasn't been probed yet, I wasn't accurate. Look upon, and at least part of the events were mentioned by General Alexander, at least in the part which I attended, barely making it from DCA. Look upon the years 2012 until 2014, end of 2014, maybe the first half of 2015, where it was clear, it was evident that the superpowers and Iran are marching towards an agreement, and they might have a tough negotiation upon the condition, but the end state of reaching an agreement was quite evident and clear, and that kind of calmed down the global cyber realm. But look upon the exchange of clashes between the United States, Israel and Iran throughout these years. These are the big Satan, we're the little Satan, and of course Iran. First there was Stuxnet. According to foreign publication, this was initiated by a collaboration process according to foreign publication. I read the Times as you do. I wouldn't know anything about it. First of all, there was Stuxnet. And Stuxnet was, according to foreign publication, initiated, and I'm saying only what was publicly released by the two nations. Immediately afterwards, there was this wave of attacks by Iran. Rasgaz and Aramco were mentioned by General Alexander as those were very serious attacks. Most of their effects weren't known due to two reasons. The first of which is that the oil and gas, natural gas production systems weren't hurt, just the management systems of those two companies. And secondly, the effects of the results, to a certain extent, were not openly released to the American public. And I'm being very, I'm using an understatement, a British type of an understatement while saying this. So this was one clash. Then you've had, at least to my best knowledge, 3 waves of attacks upon the US banking system. And in Israel, we had a couple of attacks, all of them instigated, perpetrated by Iran. DDoS, some more sophisticated versions of DDoS. None of them really harmed any kind of critical system. They took the PM's office website off for a couple of hours. The PM was truly satisfied. He wasn't that mad at it. But what I'm saying is that to my best knowledge, apart from the Russian incidents in plural, not in single, this is Georgia, Estonia, and of course the Ukraine, there are use cases or study cases to be analyzed. So when I say it hasn't been probed or hasn't been tried before, no, it has been tried before. And my last comment regarding attribution, this was a question from the audience a couple of minutes ago. I advocated for the existence, and you spoke about it, sir, the existence of the difficulty of attribution and fact-finding and producing sums. When you look upon globally, upon the bad guys team's size, this is not a team size of 10 or 15 belligerent factors on a global basis. You have 3, 4, maybe 5 belligerent factors. So producing evidence might not be as immediate as it is in the classical cases, but eventually, if you really would like to know, and I will explain the if you would like to know who is behind the attack, eventually you would know. It might take you a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. At the end, you will know. When I come to the issue of policymakers, of decision makers, sometimes it is more convenient for them in order not to even begin climbing this ladder of escalatory steps, to have a kind of an ostrich type of policy. This is non-attributional, no one took responsibility, there is deniability, we can't prove hardcore evidence, so we choose to do nothing. Now, of course, if you have 2 or 3 power grids go out, then you might not be able, when you take into consideration your home front public opinion, to have this ostrich type of possibility. But this is, again, so delicate balance between deniability, attribution, retaliation, and not climbing the escalatory ladder.
Terrific. I think we're out of time, but I thank you all very much for your time and your questions, and thank the panel especially.